What if a thought could be contagious? Not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal, biological way. As if a concept itself could achieve a kind of viral load, leaping from mind to mind through a shared glance of despair. We are taught that plagues are carried in the blood, transmitted by the flea, or passed through the water we drink. We understand the physical mechanisms of disease. We can map the genes of a virus and track its spread across continents. We build our defenses with medicine and science, secure in our belief that the enemy is a tangible, physical entity that can be isolated, studied, and, ultimately, defeated. But history holds a darker, more unsettling lesson. A story that slides like a shard of ice under the warm blanket of our modern certainties. It teaches us that sometimes the most devastating plague of all is the one that is born from nothing. The one that has no pathogen, no physical cause, and no cure. The one that begins and ends entirely in the mind. This is the story of such a plague, a fever not of the body, but of the soul. In the suffocating summer of 1518, in the free imperial city of Strasbourg, a horrifying contagion swept through the populace. It had only one symptom, an uncontrollable, relentless, and ultimately fatal urge to dance. It sounds like a passage from a Grimm's fairy tale, a bizarre and morbid fantasy, but for the more than 400 citizens of Strasbourg who were afflicted, this nightmare was terrifyingly real. They danced without music, without joy, and without rest. They danced as their shoes filled with blood. They danced until their bodies broke. They danced until their hearts gave out. This phenomenon, known to history as the Dancing Plague of 1518, is more than just a bizarre footnote. It is a terrifying case study in what modern psychology calls mass psychogenic illness. It serves as a chilling testament to the raw, untamed power of the human mind to manifest its deepest fears into a physical, deadly force. The story of the Dancing Plague is the story of a city pushed beyond its breaking point, a community that became the host for a virus made of pure terror. To understand what happened, we must dissect the conditions that allowed such a thing to be possible. We must examine the anatomy of a city's dread and uncover the secret history of a 500-year-old weapon. In our own age of anxiety and digital contagion, may be more relevant than ever. To truly comprehend the madness that seized, one must first breathe the air of 1518. It was an atmosphere thick with the stench of fear, piety, and decay. Strasbourg, a jewel of the Holy Roman Empire, was a city living on the edge of a knife. The Grand Cathedral, a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, clawed at the sky, a constant reminder of God's power and, more importantly, His wrath. But on the streets below, life was a far cry from divine grace. The preceding decade had been one of relentless misery, a slow-motion apocalypse that had ground the spirit of the populace into a fine, flammable dust. The trouble had begun with the weather. A series of brutal, unforgiving winters had given way to wet, cold springs. The grain, the very lifeblood of the city, rotted in the fields. Famine, a specter that haunted the medieval world, was no longer a distant threat but a resident in every home. The official city chronicles of the time paint a grim picture. The price of wheat and rice skyrocketed, leaving the common people to subsist on boiled roots, tree bark, and loaves of bread baked with little more than chaff and sawdust. The faces in the streets were gaunt, their skin stretched tight over their bones, their eyes hollowed out with the dull, aching emptiness of chronic hunger. The cries of starving children were a constant, harrowing soundtrack to daily life. This was not just poverty, it was a profound, systemic starvation that weakens not only the body but also the mind, leaving it vulnerable and suggestible. Upon this foundation of hunger, disease, the city's narrow, unpaved streets were open sewers, channels of filth and refuse where pigs and rats roamed freely. In these conditions, epidemics moved like wildfire. Leprosy was a common sight, its victims forced to ring bells to announce their cursed presence. Syphilis, a new and terrifying scourge, crept through the population, and a mysterious, horrifyingly swift illness they called the English sweat could claim a healthy man in a matter of hours. Death was not a private, dignified affair. It was public, ever-present, and brutal. The tolling of funeral bells was as common as the baker's morning call. The people of Strasbourg were living in a state of constant, low-level trauma, perpetually surrounded by the specter of their own mortality. This physical suffering was amplified by an intense spiritual anxiety. The year 1518 stood at the very precipice of the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther had published his 95 Theses just 1 year prior, and the shock waves were beginning to tear through the fabric of Christendom. The absolute authority of the Catholic Church, once the unshakable foundation of reality, was being challenged. For the common person, this was not an abstract theological debate. It was a terrifying spiritual crisis. If the Church could be wrong, what was true? If the path to salvation was no longer clear, what horrors awaited them in the afterlife? This uncertainty created a fertile ground for extreme piety, and an even more extreme fear of sin and damnation. Into this world of superstition, the local folklore wove its own dark threads. In the lands around Strasbourg, there was a deeply ingrained legend of Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr. While he was a patron saint for dancers and entertainers, he was also believed to possess a terrible power. It was said that those who angered him would be struck by a curse, an uncontrollable, frantic dance that would lead to their exhaustion and death. This was not a mere fairy tale told to frighten children. In the 16th century mind, where the supernatural and the natural were seamlessly intertwined, the dancing curse of Saint Vitus was a real and present danger, a recognized form of divine punishment. So this was Strasbourg in July of 1518, a city of the starving, the sick, and the terrified, a community collectively holding its breath, weakened by a decade of suffering and spiritually adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The people were a tightly wound spring of repressed anxiety, a powder keg of collective dread. All that was needed was a single, human spark to ignite a psychological inferno that would consume the city. The 14th of July dawned not with the gentle promise of a summer morning, but with the oppressive, suffocating weight of a furnace. In the city of Strasbourg, the air was already thick and still, heavy with the stench of the river Ill, the smoke of countless wood fires, and the unspoken anxieties of a populace worn down to a raw nerve. The cobblestones of the street where Frau Trafia lived already shimmered with a heat that promised a day of misery, a day best spent in the shaded quiet of one's home. But on this morning, for reasons that history has buried and only psychology can attempt to excavate, Frau Trafia chose not to stay indoors. History tells us almost nothing of the woman herself. She is a name, a catalyst, a ghost in the machine of a historical nightmare. But she was a person, a woman living in a world of profound hardship. Perhaps she had recently buried a child, another small victim of the fevers that swept through the city like a phantom reaper. Perhaps her husband, a craftsman whose guild was struggling, brought home less and less money, leaving the taste of hunger a constant, bitter presence in their mouths. Perhaps the sermons of the cathedral, filled with fiery warnings of damnation and the ever-present threat of a wrathful God, had taken a particularly deep and poisonous root in her weary soul. We will never know the specific weight that finally broke her. We only know that on this day, something within her snapped. She stepped out of the dark doorway of her timber-framed house. She was not dressed for the market or for church. She wore a simple, worn linen dress, her hair likely unkempt. Her neighbors, peering through the leaded glass of their windows, might have initially thought she was simply seeking a breath of air, however stale. But she did not stop at her doorstep. She walked with a strange, deliberate slowness to the very center of the street, a small, dusty clearing between the leaning houses. And there, she stopped. For a long moment, she stood perfectly still. Her face was a blank mask, her eyes wide and unfocused, staring at something beyond the physical world, beyond the timber and stone of her reality. A neighbor, the baker's wife, might have called out, "Frau Trofia, are you well?" But there was no response. Then, it began. It did not start as a dance. It started as a twitch, a small, almost imperceptible tremor in her left foot, a slight shuffle on the dusty cobblestones. Then, her right foot joined in, a clumsy, uncoordinated echo of the first. Her arms, which had been hanging limply at her sides, began to lift, her fingers splaying and clenching as if trying to grasp at smoke. It was a horrifying spectacle, the sight of a human body decoupling from its own will. Her mind may have been screaming for stillness, for control, but her limbs were responding to a different, invisible master. She was a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a phantom puppeteer inside her own skull. The initial reaction from her neighbors was likely one of nervous confusion. A few might have chuckled, thinking it a strange, private joke or a sign of too much cheap wine. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the laughter died, replaced by a thick, unsettling silence. The shuffle became a stomp. The arm waving became a frantic flailing. Her movements were not joyful, not rhythmic, not celebratory. They were the violent, erratic jerks of a body in profound distress, a silent scream made of flesh and bone. She danced through the heat of midday, the sun beating down on her unprotected head. Her face became slick with sweat, her dress clinging to her body. Dust kicked up by her ceaseless movements coated her legs and the hem of her dress in a layer of grime. She did not stop for water. She did not stop for rest. The baker's wife crossed herself, whispering of demonic possession. The blacksmith, a man of practical strength, might have suggested restraining her, but a primal fear held them all back. What if it was contagious? Not the dance itself, but the madness that caused it. They were a people who believed that the devil could enter through a single, unguarded thought. As the afternoon wore on, her horrifying performance became the sole focus of the neighborhood. Work ceased. Shutters remained open. Faces, pale with a mixture of fascination and terror, watched her every move. She had become a living effigy of their own collective anxiety. Her silent, endless suffering was a physical manifestation of the hunger, the grief, and the spiritual dread that simmered beneath the surface of their own lives. When the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the street, a new kind of horror set in. Surely, now, she would collapse. Surely, the night would bring an end to this waking nightmare. But it did not. She danced on as the sky turned from orange to indigo, her jerking silhouette a horrifying spectacle against the twilight. Her husband, a man broken by shame and confusion, came out and pleaded with her, tried to hold her, but her body, fueled by a terrifying, unnatural energy, pushed him away. She was beyond his reach, beyond anyone's reach. She was alone in her madness. The city guard was called, but they too were at a loss. There was no law against dancing. They simply stood there, weapons in hand, watching a single, unarmed woman hold an entire street hostage with her relentless, inexplicable motion. The first day ended, but the dance did not. Frau Trafia, the patient zero of a plague that had no name, continued her solitary torment under the cold, indifferent light of the moon, and the city of Strasbourg watched, holding its breath, not yet knowing that the spark they were witnessing was about to ignite an inferno. The dawn of the third day brought no relief. It only brought a continuation of the horror, now baked into the city's routine. Frau Trafia was still dancing. The spectacle had lost its initial shock value and had curdled into something far more profound and unsettling. She was no longer just a madwoman. She had become a living monument to suffering, a permanent fixture in the landscape of the street. The physical toll was now terrifyingly visible. Her simple linen dress was dark with sweat and caked with the grime of the street. Her face, once perhaps full of life, was now a gaunt, skeletal mask, smeared with dirt, where she had tried to wipe away the sweat. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were bloodshot and sunken, staring into an abyss that was hers alone. Her feet, the instruments of her torment, were a bloody, swollen mess, the worn leather of her shoes having long since given way, leaving her to stomp on the hot, sharp cobblestones with raw, bleeding flesh. Yet, she did not seem to register the pain. She was beyond it, trapped in a relentless rhythm that had consumed her entirely. The neighborhood had become a silent theater of dread. The residents no longer went about their daily business. The baker's oven remained cold. The blacksmith's hammer lay silent. Life had paused, held captive by the horrifying performance in their midst. They watched from their windows and doorways, not with simple curiosity, but with a deep, personal unease. In Frau Trafia's endless, agonizing dance, they saw a terrifying reflection of their own internal state. Her physical exhaustion mirrored their spiritual fatigue. Her public torment was an externalization of their private grief and hunger. She was a living symbol of a world that had spun out of control, a body possessed not necessarily by a demon from hell, but by the very real demons of famine, disease, and despair that afflicted them all. This shared, unspoken identification was the fertile ground upon which the psychological virus would grow. The constant, unresolved spectacle created an unbearable tension. It was impossible to look away, yet painful to watch. The rhythmic, dull thud of her bloody feet on the stones became a hypnotic, maddening drumbeat that echoed in the minds of everyone who heard it. For days, they had been asking the same silent questions. Is she possessed? Is she a saint in the throes of divine ecstasy? Is this a punishment from God? Is it a warning? This uncertainty was a form of psychological torture for the entire community, and the human mind, when faced with such a cognitive void, will desperately seek an answer, or worse, an escape. The first to break was a woman named Elsbeth, the wife of a tanner who lived just down the street. Elsbeth had buried her third child, a baby boy, just 2 months prior, a victim of the sweating sickness. Her grief was a raw, open wound, a private agony she bore in the suffocating silence of her home. For 3 days, she had watched Frau Treff. She had felt the woman's suffering as if it were her own. The relentless, physical motion seemed to her not like madness, but like the only possible response to a world of unbearable pain. On the afternoon of the 4th day, as the hypnotic thudding continued, something in Elsbeth's mind fractured. She had been kneading dough, her hands working automatically while her mind was locked on the scene outside. Thud. The pressure in her chest, the unshed tears, the silent screams of her own grief needed a way out. Without a conscious thought, her hands stilled. She wiped the flour from her apron, walked out of her home, and with the same blank, vacant expression as Frau Treffia, she too began to dance. Her movements were stiff at first, then more convulsive, a mirror of the original dancer. She had found the escape. She had joined the performance, her private suffering now given a public, physical form. Elsbeth's submission broke the dam. Her act served as a powerful, terrifying permission slip for the rest of the community. The fear that had held them paralyzed now had an alternative. Participation. A young journeyman, his future bleak, and his stomach empty, threw down his tools with a cry of frustration and joined the dance. 2 older women, who had been whispering rosaries in a doorway, suddenly went silent, their hands dropping as their feet began to shuffle. The contagion was spreading not by touch or by breath, but by sight and by suggestion. The psychological virus, having found its first new host in Elsbeth, was now leaping through the crowd. Within hours, the scene had transformed from the tragedy of a single individual into a chaotic group phenomenon. The lone, rhythmic thud was now a cacophony of dozens of stomping, shuffling, and dragging feet. The silence was shattered by the grunts of exertion, the occasional sob, and the heavy, ragged breathing of the growing crowd of dancers. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and desperation. The city's social fabric was unraveling in real time. The unspoken rules of public decorum, of self-control, of sanity, had been suspended. As dusk fell, the scene became even more hellish. The group of nearly 36 dancers did not disperse, lit by the flickering, uncertain light of torches brought out by horrified but mesmerized onlookers. They writhed and jerked like souls in a Bosch painting. They were no longer individuals. They were a single, pulsating organism of mass hysteria. The spark had caught fire, and the city of Strasbourg was now facing a terrifying, undeniable crisis. The madness was no longer confined to one woman on one street. It was a wildfire burning through the very soul of the city. As the number of dancers swelled from a disturbing handful into an undeniable public menace, the initial paralysis of Strasbourg's leadership gave way to a frantic scramble for action. The city was a beacon of Renaissance pride, a free imperial city that answered only to the emperor himself. Its leaders, wealthy guild masters, stern magistrates, and educated physicians saw themselves as enlightened men, bastions of order and reason against the chaotic tide of peasant superstition. The sight of nearly 36 of their citizens jerking uncontrollably in the streets was not just a crisis of public health, it was an affront to their very identity, a stain upon the city's reputation for sober industry. An emergency council was convened in the great hall of the Peffolds, the city's administrative heart. The air in the cavernous, wood-fennelled room was thick with tension. Light struggled to filter through the tall, stained glass windows, illuminating swirling dust motes and the anxious faces of the city's most powerful men. At the head of the long oak table sat Theob, the formidable head of the city's guilds, a man whose face seemed to be permanently carved into a scowl of disapproval. Beside him were the city magistrates and, most importantly, a delegation of the city's physicians, robed in the dark, academic attire of their profession. They were the men of science, the voices of logic, who were expected to provide a rational explanation for the madness that had gripped their streets. The initial reports from the city guard were dismissed with contempt. Possession, one magistrate scoffed, stroking his beard. The common folk see the devil in every shadow and a curse in every stomachache. We are not a backwater village to be frightened by old wives' tales. There was a murmur of agreement around the table. To accept a supernatural cause would be to admit defeat, to concede that the world was governed by forces beyond their control. For these men, who had built their lives on the principles of commerce, law, and the nascent stirrings of scientific inquiry, such an admission was unthinkable. Their pride demanded a worldly explanation, a tangible cause that could be met with a tangible solution. The burden of providing this explanation fell upon the physicians. They had spent the previous day among the dancers, a frustrating and deeply unsettling experience. They had tried to question the afflicted, but had received no response beyond vacant stares or guttural moans. They had checked for fevers, but found only the heat of extreme physical exertion. They had looked for the telltale rashes of plague or smallpox, but the dancers' skin was clear, save for the bruises and cuts on their feet. The phenomenon fit no known disease. In the great medical texts of Galen or Hip, it was a malady without a clear pathology, a sickness without a name. Frustrated and facing immense pressure to provide an answer, the physicians fell back on the bedrock of their entire medical understanding, the ancient theory of the four humors. This doctrine, which had dominated Western medicine for over 1,000 years, held that the human body was composed of four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The healthy person was one in whom these four humors were in perfect balance. Sickness, both of the body and the mind, was believed to be the result of an imbalance, an excess of one humor over the others. From this framework, they constructed their diagnosis. The dancers' frantic movements, their flushed skin, their profuse sweating, all of it pointed to a clear excess of one humor, blood. They concluded that the victims were suffering from a condition of hot blood, an overheating of their natural humors that had agitated their brains and thrown their bodies into a state of manic, uncontrolled motion. It was a natural, if extreme, physical ailment. Having given the madness a name, they could now prescribe a cure, one that flowed with perfect, disastrous logic from their initial diagnosis. The principle of humoral medicine was simple. To cure an excess, one must remove it. If a patient had too much blood, they were bled with leeches or by lancing a vein. Therefore, if the dancers' bodies were overheated, they must be cooled, and the body's natural way of cooling itself was through sweat. The physicians reasoned that the dancing, while a symptom, was also the body's own desperate attempt at a cure. The body was trying to dance the fever out, to sweat the poison of the hot blood from its system. The reason it wasn't working, they concluded, was that the dancers were not committing to the cure with enough vigor. The prescription, therefore, was not to restrain the dancers, but to encourage them. The council, relieved to have a scientific-sounding course of action, a way to impose order on the chaos, readily agreed. Theobald von Kaisersberg, with a decisive bang of his fist on the table, issued the official proclamations. The city would actively facilitate the cure. The decision was a masterpiece of flawed logic, an act of profound intellectual hubris. The leaders of Strasbourg, in their desperate attempt to reject one form of superstition, the belief in curses, and demons, had fallen victim to another, the unshakable, dogmatic belief in their own flawed science. They could not see that the chaos in the streets was a symptom of a deeper societal sickness, a physical manifestation of the very poverty and despair they oversaw. They looked at a starving, terrified populace breaking under the strain of existence, and they saw only a case of hot blood. This fatal misreading, this clinical detachment from human suffering, would turn a bizarre local crisis into a full-blown catastrophe. They believed they were prescribing a cure, but in reality, they were about to pour gasoline on a raging fire. With the official decree from the city council echoing through the narrow streets, Strasbourg prepared to implement its scientifically sanctioned cure for the dancing plague. Instead of the hushed tones of a city grappling with a mysterious affliction, a bizarre energy began to permeate the atmosphere. Carpenters were conscripted to clear the vast, open space of the grain market, the very heart of the city's commerce and, for many, a stark reminder of their empty life. Here, under the watchful gaze of the towering cathedral, a massive wooden stage began to rise, its timbers groaning under the hurried efforts of the workmen. It was to be a grand platform for the city's collective sweating cure, a place where the afflicted could vigorously expel the excess humors that were believed to be poisoning their minds. The rationale, as flawed as it was, held a certain grim logic for the authorities. If the body needed to sweat out the hot blood, then it stood to reason that encouraging, vigorous movement in a public space would be the most effective way to facilitate this purging. The fresh air, they reasoned, would also aid in the process. Despite the fact that the air itself was thick with the dust and the general miasma of a densely packed medieval city, the visual of hundreds of people energetically dancing in the central marketplace was envisioned as a sign of the city's proactive response to the crisis, a testament to their enlightened approach to public health. They failed to grasp the crucial difference between a natural physical ailment, manifestation of profound psychological distress, To further encourage the therapeutic dancing, the city magistrates took another decisive step. They issued a call for musicians. Pipers, drummers, and fiddlers were hired at the city's expense, instructed to play lively, upbeat tunes for the dancers, day and night. The belief was that the music would lift the spirits of the afflicted, and provide a necessary rhythm for their exertions, preventing them from succumbing to exhaustion before the cure could take effect. It was a well-intentioned, yet utterly misguided, attempt to impose order on a phenomenon that was fundamentally chaotic and driven by forces they did not understand. The sound of cheerful melodies now mingled with the increasingly frantic thud of hundreds of feet, and the ragged gasps for air, creating a surreal and deeply unsettling soundscape in the heart of Strasbourg. The presence of the stage and the musicians transformed the nature of the event. What had begun as a spontaneous and terrifying outbreak was now being actively orchestrated and amplified by the city itself. The dancers, no longer isolated individuals in their private torment, were now performers on a public stage, their movements unintentionally synchronized by the relentless beat of the drums and the shrill calls of the pipes. The spectacle drew even larger crowds of onlookers, their fear and morbid fascination drawing them to the grain market like moths to a flickering flame. The event ceased to be solely about the suffering of the afflicted. It became a form of public entertainment, a bizarre and macabre carnival unfolding in the shadow of the famine and disease that still gripped the city. Healthy citizens, fueled by a mixture of civic duty and morbid curiosity, were even encouraged to join the dancers, to provide them with partners, and to maintain the energy of the collective movement. The authorities saw this as an act of communal support, a way to buoy the spirits of the sick and hasten their recovery. In reality, this close proximity between the afflicted and the healthier created an even greater opportunity for the psychological contagion to spread. Witnessing the entranced state of the dancers, the vacant look in their eyes, and the relentless, almost superhuman energy of their movements, likely planted seeds of anxiety and suggestion in the minds of the observers, further blurring the lines between the rationale and the irrational. The stage was set, quite literally, for disaster. The city of Strasbourg, in its earnest, yet profoundly misguided attempt to cure a plague it did not understand, had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for its escalation, by providing a focal point, a rhythm, and a sense of public legitimacy to the dancing. They had amplified the psychological distress and removed any remaining in it. The cure was about to become the very fuel that would turn a localized outbreak into a devastating inferno, a testament to the catastrophic consequences of applying flawed logic to a problem rooted not in the physical body, but in the infinitely more complex and mysterious landscape of the human mind. The authorities' decision to treat the dancing plague with more dancing was not merely a mistake. It was the striking of a match in a room filled with dry tinder. The city of Strasbourg, already simmering with a low-grade fever of anxiety and despair, was about to be plunged into a full-blown inferno of mass hysteria. The stage in the grain market, intended as a clinical space for a prescribed cure, became the epicenter of a psychological earthquake, and the musicians, hired as therapists, became the Pied Pipers leading a procession to doom. The first few hours of the organized dance were a scene of grotesque paradox. The lively, almost joyous melodies of the pipes and fiddles clashed horribly with the grim reality on the stage. The dancers, their numbers now swelling past 100, were not celebrating. Their movements were violent and spastic, their limbs flailing with the desperate energy of the truly tormented. They were a population primed for a breakdown, and what they saw on that stage was a physical manifestation of the chaos they felt within their own souls. A young weaver, his guilt struggling and his own future uncertain, stood in the crowd, watching a woman he knew from his street spin until she collapsed, only to be pulled back to her feet by hired helpers. By the end of the first week of the prescribed cure, the number of dancers had exploded. The stage was no longer large enough. The madness spilled back into the streets, with frantic, sweating groups of people dancing in every square and alleyway. The city had become a Bosch painting brought to life, a landscape of perpetual, agonizing motion. Then came the inevitable result. The human body, for all its resilience, is a fragile machine. It is not designed for this kind of relentless, non-stop exertion. The first to die was a strong man, a stoneman, who after 4 days of continuous dancing, suddenly clutched his chest, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and fell to the ground, dead from a massive heart attack. They were prisoners of a biological imperative that had been hijacked by a psychological terror. The city's social order disintegrated. The market was empty of goods, its commerce replaced by a theater of death. The workshops were silent. The streets, once arteries of life and trade, were now veins of madness, clogged with the writhing bodies of the afflicted. Their rational, scientific cure had failed in the most spectacular and public way imaginable. They had tried to impose order on the chaos, and in doing so, had become its primary agent. They had unleashed a monster of collective hysteria that they now had no power to control. The inferno raged, consuming the city's inhabitants one by one, a horrifying testament to the fact that the most dangerous plagues are not the ones that attack the body, but the ones that set the mind against itself. The city of Strasbourg was no longer just suffering, it was consuming itself alive. The turning of the tide by the first weeks of August, the city of Strasbourg was no longer a functioning metropolis. It was a charnel house set to music, the grand experiment in public health, born from the confident but flawed science of the city's elite, had devolved into a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe. The stage in the grain market, once a symbol of the authorities' control, now stood as a monument to their failure. The relentless music, intended to be a therapeutic rhythm, had become a macabre funeral dirge that haunted the city day and night. The death toll, once a trickle, had become a steady, horrifying stream. Dozens had perished, their bodies, broken by ceaseless motion, carted away in the dead of night to be buried in hastily consecrated pits. The city was hemorrhaging life, and the prescribed cure was only hastening the bleeding. The mood within the great hall of the Pefforts had shifted from arrogant certainty to a cold, creeping panic. The whispers of the common folk, once dismissed as ignorant superstition, now seemed like a terrifying possibility. What if this wasn't a disease of the humus? What if it was a punishment, a divine curse sent to chastise a sinful city? This shift in thinking was a quiet, desperate surrender, an admission that they were facing a force that operated outside the laws of man and medicine. It was widely believed in the Germanic lands that Saint Vitus held the power to inflict a terrible curse upon those who showed him disrespect or lived a life of sin. The curse was a cruel parody of his patronage. He would force the sinner to dance uncontrollably, without rest, until they either repented or died from sheer exhaustion. The frenetic music of the pipes and drums, which they had hoped would be a cure, was now seen as a blasphemous aggravation, an insult to the heaven. The first order of business was to stop the music. The musicians were dismissed, and for the first time in weeks, a fragile, unsettling silence began to fall over the city, punctuated only by the scuffing of feet and the ragged breathing of the remaining dancers. It was a heavy, accusatory silence, filled with the ghosts of the dead and the lingering question of what had truly happened. The leaders believed they had correctly identified a spiritual enemy. They had no way of knowing that the true cause was not an angry saint in the heavens, but the intricate, fragile, and terrifyingly powerful landscape of the human mind. The procession of the afflicted to the shrine of Saint Vitus marked the end of the public spectacle, but it was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of the first chapter. The city of Strasbourg, in its desperation, had settled on a supernatural explanation, a narrative of curse and penance that fit neatly into their 16th century worldview. For them, the case was closed. But for us, looking back across the gulf of 500 years, the investigation is just beginning. To understand how a bizarre, localized madness could erupt into a full-blown psychological epidemic, we must perform an autopsy. Not on the bodies of the dead, but on the collective mind of the city that produced them. Let us begin by dissecting the first and most crucial ingredient in this deadly recipe, the profound, systemic, and unrelenting stress that had been grinding the people of Strasbourg down for the better part of a decade. This was not the modern anxiety of deadlines and traffic jams. This was a deep, existential dread, a daily struggle for survival that had pushed an entire population to the very edge of its psychological endurance. The mind, like the body, can only withstand so much pressure before it begins to fracture. The foundation of this trauma was starvation. The famines that preceded 1518 were not mere food shortages. They were catastrophic failures of the natural world that brought society to its knees. We must imagine what this truly felt like. It was the taste of bread made with more sawdust and tree bark than actual flour, a coarse, gritty substance that filled the belly but offered no nourishment. It was the gnawing, ever-present ache in the pit of the stomach that no amount of boiled roots or thin gruel could ever truly satisfy. It was the sight of one's own children, their limbs rail-thin, their bellies swollen from malnutrition, their eyes large and haunted with a hunger that their parents were powerless to appease. This constant state of malnutrition has profound psychological effects. A brain starved of essential nutrients is a brain in a state of perpetual alarm. It triggers anxiety, deepens depression, and shortens the fuse of human temper, leading to irritability and aggression. The world, viewed through the lens of starvation, becomes a hostile, threatening place. Rational decision-making is eroded, replaced by the primal, desperate instinct to survive. Layered on top of this hunger was the constant, terrifying presence of disease. In a world without germ theory, without antibiotics, without a true understanding of contagion, sickness was a mysterious and malevolent force. The Strasbourg of 1518 was a landscape of medical horror. The black pustules of smallpox were a common sight, a death sentence for many, and a mark of disfigurement for the survivors. Lepers, their bodies slowly disintegrating, were a walking embodiment of God's wrath, forced to ring bells to warn the healthy of their approach. Their existence a form of living death defined by social ostracism. And then there was the new terror, the English sweat, an illness so swift and lethal it could turn a healthy man into a corpse in under a day. This environment created a state of relentless hyper. Every neighbor's cough, every stranger's touch, every unusual ache in one's own body could be a harbinger of doom. This constant proximity to death erodes the very foundations of social trust. It isolates people in their fear, turning the community from a source of comfort into a network of potential threats. The economic despair was just as corrosive. Strasbourg was a city of artisans, craftsmen, and merchants. Their livelihoods were intricately tied to the health of the surrounding countryside. When the harvests failed, the farmers had no grain to sell and no money to buy the goods produced in the city. The weaver's loom fell silent. The blacksmith's forge grew cold. The tanner's vats stood empty. For a man in a guild, his work was not just a job. It was his identity, his place in the social hierarchy. To lose that was to lose his sense of purpose, to be cast adrift in a world that no longer had a place for him. This economic paralysis created a profound sense of helplessness, a belief that no amount of hard work or piety could alter one's grim fate. Within this landscape of suffering, the burden often fell most heavily on women. They were the managers of the household, tasked with the impossible duty of feeding their families from empty pantries. They were the primary caregivers, sitting vigil over sick and dying children, absorbing the trauma of loss with a frequency we can scarcely imagine today. Furthermore, in a world that sought supernatural explanations for misfortune, women were the most common targets of suspicion. An unusual crop failure, a sudden illness, it was often a woman. An outcast, an herbalist, who was blamed and accused of witchcraft. They lived under a constant cloud of potential accusation, their every action scrutinized. It is perhaps no surprise, then, that this epidemic of the mind was ignited by, and disproportionately affected, the women of Strasbourg. Theirs was a mind already bearing the heaviest load. When we combine these elements, we see a city that was, in clinical terms, a collective trauma victim. A traumatized mind does not operate rationally. It is a mind that is constantly scanning for threats, a mind whose fight or flight response is permanently engaged. It is a mind that is highly susceptible to suggestion, desperate for any narrative, any explanation that can make sense of its unbearable suffering. The people of Strasbourg were living in a state of chronic, unresolved fear. Their minds and bodies weakened, their spirits eroded. They were the dry, brittle kindling, piled high in the heart of the city. All that was missing was the second ingredient in the recipe for madness, a spark of superstition to set it all ablaze. If the chronic, grinding stress of daily life was the dry kindling for the psychological inferno then the second ingredient was the fuel itself, a potent, highly flammable mixture of deep-seated superstition and specific religious fear. To truly understand the events of 1580, we must temporarily shed our modern, secular worldview and step into the mental landscape of a 16th century European. This was a world where the veil between the physical and the supernatural was thin, almost not. For the people of Strasbourg, the world was not a clockwork machine governed by predictable laws of physics. It was a grand, terrifying theater of divine will, a constant battleground between the forces of God and Satan, where saints and demons actively intervened in the lives of mortals. In this worldview, misfortune was rarely seen as a random occurrence. A failed harvest was not simply the result of poor weather. It was a sign of God's displeasure. A sudden illness was not a biological event. but a potential demonic assault or a divine punishment for a hidden sin. This belief system, while a source of spiritual comfort in good times, became a powerful engine of paranoia and fear in times of crisis. When faced with the inexplicable horror of the dancing, the minds of the Strasbourg citizens did not search for a medical cause. They searched for a supernatural culprit, and in the rich, dark soil of their local folklore, a specific and terrifying figure was readily available. The historical Saint Vitus was a 4th century child martyr, a Sicilian boy who, according to legend, was persecuted for his Christian faith by the Roman Emperor Diocletian. The stories of his life were filled with miraculous healing. He was said to have cured the emperor's own son of a form of epilepsy, an illness characterized by convulsions and uncontrolled movements. Over the centuries, this association with healing convulsive disorders led to him becoming the patron saint for those suffering from epilepsy, neurological disorders, and, ironically, for dancers and entertainers. People would pray to him for protection from illnesses that caused the body to shake and jerk uncontrollably. However, in the Germanic lands of the Holy Roman Empire, the veneration of Saint Vitus had taken on a darker, more menacing dimension. The power to heal, in the medieval mind, was intrinsically linked to the power to inflict. A saint who could cure a convulsive disease must also, they reasoned, be able to cause one. This dual nature was common. Saints were not just benevolent intercessors, but powerful, sometimes wrathful, entities who demanded respect and piety. Over centuries, the legend evolved. Saint Vitus became known as a figure who would punish sinners, adulterers, and the impious with a horrifying curse. That curse was a cruel and direct parody of his patronage. He would force the sinner to dance. This was not a dance of celebration. It was the dance of Saint Vitus, a state of frantic, compulsive, and agonizing movement that would continue until the victim collapsed or died. The belief in this specific curse was not a fringe superstition. It was a deeply embedded cultural reality. In the century leading up to the 1518 outbreak, several smaller-scale incidents of dancing mania had been recorded in the towns and villages along the Rhine River. Each time, the phenomenon was attributed to the wrath of Saint Vitus, culturally specific diagnoses for a terrifying affliction. This belief system, while seemingly irrational to us, served a critical psychological function for the people of the 16th century. Firstly, it provided a clear and unambiguous explanation for their suffering. In a world of random, senseless tragedy, the idea of a specific curse gave the chaos a narrative. They were not suffering because of unpredictable weather patterns or poor sanitation. They were suffering because they had, as a community, angered a powerful saint. This, in a strange way, was more comforting than a world without meaning. Secondly, and more importantly, a specific diagnosis offered the hope of a specific cure. If the problem was an angry saint, the solution was not to be found in medicine, but in penance. The path to healing was through prayer, religious processions, and pilgrimages to the saint shrines. This gave the people a sense of agency, a set of actions they could take to appease the supernatural force tormenting them. It provided a roadmap out of the nightmare, a structured response to a chaotic event. This is precisely why, when Frau Trafia began her frantic dance, the minds of her neighbors did not leap to a conclusion of physical illness. They leapt to the most logical explanation their culture could offer. It was the curse of Saint Vitus. Her breakdown provided the physical evidence for their deepest superstitious fears. And when the city authorities, having failed with their own scientific theories, finally embraced this supernatural explanation, they were merely confirming what the public already believed to be true. Their decision to send the dancers on a forced pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus was the final, logical step in this shared cultural delusion. Thus, the superstition was not a mere background detail in this tragedy. It was an active and essential ingredient. It was the software of belief running on the hardware of their stressed and malnourished brains. It provided the specific script for the madness. The city was a powder keg of generalized anxiety. But the legend of Saint Vitus was the specific chemical that ensured the explosion would take the unique and bizarre form of a dancing plague. It channeled the raw, undifferentiated terror of the populace into a single, horrifying, and culturally resonant performance of mass hysteria. We have now dissected two of the core components of the disaster that befell. We have explored the landscape of the city's collective mind, a terrain scarred by the deep wounds of famine, disease, and economic despair the kindling. We have also examined the specific cultural and religious beliefs that shaped their reality, the potent folklore of an angry saint and his dancing curse the fuel. But kindling and fuel, no matter how volatile, cannot create an inferno without a spark, and, more importantly, without the wind to fan the flames. This final stage of our psychological autopsy will examine the mechanism of the contagion itself, the psychological trigger that started the fire, and the disastrous social validation that turned it into a wildfire. Let us return to the lonely, tragic figure of Frau Trafia. For weeks, we have seen her as a catalyst, a historical footnote. But to understand the plague, we must see her as a human being at the absolute limit of her endurance. The immense, unspoken, personal pressures she was under, grief, hunger, spiritual anxiety, had pushed her beyond a rational breaking point. Modern psychology provides a clinical name for what likely happened to her: a dissociative state, or a stress-induced trance. Under unbearable psychological pressure, the human mind has a desperate defense mechanism. It can split. The conscious, rational part of the self, the part that feels the pain and understands the hopelessness of the situation, effectively shuts down. It disconnects from the body. In its place, the subconscious, the primal part of the brain, takes over. Her dance, therefore, was not a conscious act. It was the physical manifestation of a mind that had shattered. It was her body acting out the silent, screaming trauma that her conscious mind could no longer process. She was, in effect, a sleepwalker in a waking nightmare. Her limbs controlled by the raw, chaotic energy of her own repressed anguish. She was the first victim, a person whose personal suffering had become so great it could no longer be contained within the confines of her own skull, and had to erupt into public view in this bizarre, physical form. This is the spark. But how did this intensely personal breakdown become a collective one? The answer lies in the wiring of our own brains, in a fascinating neurological phenomenon known as mirror neurons. Our brains are hardwired for empathy. When we see someone perform an action or experience an emotion, a part of our brain fires as if we are performing that action or feeling that emotion ourselves. It's why we cringe when we see someone get hurt, or smile when we see someone laugh. In the hypersuggestible, deeply traumatized crowd the effect of these mirror neurons would have been incredibly powerful. As they watched Frau Trafia for days on end, they were not merely passive observers. Their brains were subconsciously mirroring her state. They saw her trance, and a part of their own mind began to resonate with it. They saw a physical release for a psychological pressure they all shared. For the most vulnerable individuals in the crowd, those whose own internal suffering most closely matched, Frau Trafia Estes' constant mirroring was a dangerous invitation. Her breakdown gave them a script, a pre-written performance for their own impending collapses. It created a path of least resistance for their own minds to follow when the pressure became too much. Elsbeth, the grieving mother, did not consciously decide to dance. Her brain, primed by days of observation and amplified by her own trauma, simply followed the powerful, hypnotic example that had been given. This explains the initial spread, but it was the authorities' intervention that turned a scattered outbreak into a full-blown epidemic. Their decision to legitimize the dancing was a catastrophic act of social validation. Before the official intervention, the dancing was a strange and frightening anomaly. It was madness. But the moment the city council built a stage, cleared the guild halls, and hired musicians, they sent a powerful, unambiguous message to the entire populace. This is a real and valid response to our current situation. They removed these social inhibitions that might have kept other vulnerable people in check. They transformed a fringe event into an officially sanctioned public ritual. The cure acted as a powerful social accelerant, giving psychological permission for hundreds more to succumb. The music itself played a crucial role. It did not heal. It synchronized. It pulled the scattered individual trances into a single, collective rhythm, likely deepening the dissociative state and making it even harder for anyone to break free. This created a terrifying, self-perpetuating feedback loop of hysteria. The more people who joined the dance, the more powerful and mesmerizing the spectacle became. The more powerful the spectacle, the more it reinforced the collective belief in the reality of the Saint Vitus curse. The stronger the belief in the curse, the more anxiety it generated in the onlookers. And the more anxiety they felt, the more likely they were to break down and join the dance themselves. The city was trapped in a horrifying, escalating cycle of its own making, a psychological vortex from which there was no easy escape. The three ingredients had combined to create a perfect storm. The trauma of the city was the kindling, the superstition of Saint Vitus was the fuel, and the psychological trigger of Frau Trafia, fanned into a wildfire by the winds of official validation, was the spark. The dancing plague was not a mystery in the supernatural sense. It was the perfectly logical, albeit terrifying, outcome of a specific set of psychological and social conditions. A chilling demonstration that the most dangerous virus is the one we can't see, the one that travels on the invisible currents of fear. The last of the wagons carrying the afflicted rumbled away from Strasbourg, leaving a city not relieved, but hollowed out. The pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus marked the end of the public nightmare. Historical records are sparse on the final outcome, but they suggest that over the following weeks, away from the pressurized environment of the city, the mania did eventually subside. The last dancers collapsed into a profound, near-catatonic state of exhaustion from which some never recovered. The city slowly, painfully, began to piece itself back together. The market reopened, the workshops stirred back to life, but the silence that now filled the streets was heavy, haunted by the memory of the inferno that had consumed its people. Strasbourg had survived, but it was forever scarred by the knowledge of the madness that lurked just beneath the thin veneer of civilization. We have now performed our own psychological autopsy on this historical corpse. We have seen how the city was a powder keg of trauma, a community ground down by the relentless pressures of starvation, disease, and economic despair. We have examined the potent fuel of their superstitious worldview, specifically the culturally embedded fear of Saint Vitus and his dancing curse. And we have witnessed the spark of Frau Trefeier's personal breakdown, a trigger that was fanned into a wildfire by the catastrophic winds of official valor. The dancing plague, when dissected, ceases to be a supernatural mystery. It reveals itself as a terrifyingly logical outcome of a perfect storm of psychological and social conditions, a textbook case of mass psychogenic illness. But the lesson of the dancing plague is not one we can safely confine to the dusty pages of a history book. To dismiss it as a bizarre relic of a superstitious, unenlightened past is to miss its most terrifying implication. The story of Strasbourg is a timeless and profound testament to the incredible fragility of the human mind and the immense, often terrifying, power of collective belief. It demonstrates, in the most visceral way imaginable, that our perception of reality is not a fixed, objective truth. It is a fragile consensus, a shared story we tell ourselves, and one that can be rewritten with horrifying speed under the right kind of pressure. It is a chilling reminder that the connection between the mind and the body is not a one-way street. Profound psychological distress can, and does, manifest as real, uncontrollable, and even fatal physical symptoms. The true horror of 1518 is that the mind virus that infected the city never truly died. It did not require a superstitious belief in saints and demons to function. It only required a stressed and vulnerable population, a compelling narrative, and a mechanism for that narrative to spread. The virus simply went dormant, waiting for a new, more efficient delivery system. And in the 21st century, it has found one. The grain market of Strasbourg, the physical stage where the madness was performed and amplified, has been replaced by a far larger, more instantaneous, and more potent stage, the global town square of the internet. The musicians, hired to provide a relentless rhythm for the dance, have been replaced by modern algorithms. These algorithms, like the musicians, have no morality. They are designed for one purpose: to maximize engagement. They identify whatever is capturing human attention, whether it is joyful, informative, or hysterical, and they amplify it, pushing it to the top of our feeds, creating a powerful, self-perpetuating rhythm that is incredibly difficult to ignore. We see the echoes of the dancing plague all around us. We see it in the spread of dangerous viral TikTok challenges, where a single, bizarre behavior can be mimicked by millions in a matter of days, sometimes with tragic consequences. We see it in the financial hysteria of stock market frenzies and crypto bubbles, where a collective belief in an asset's value, detached from any underlying reality, can create fortunes and then evaporate them overnight, driven by a digital form of mob psychology. We see it in the terrifying speed with which political misinformation and conspiracy theories spread through online echo chambers. Within these digital communities, a shared narrative, however false, is repeated and reinforced until it becomes an unshakable truth for those inside, creating a trance of conviction that is immune to outside facts and logic. And we even see it in modern medical mysteries, where anxieties about certain syndromes or environmental toxins can spread online, causing groups of people to experience real, medically unexplained physical symptoms, a modern form of psychogenic illness. The weapons have changed. The fear of an angry saint has been replaced by the fear of missing out, the fear of being on the wrong side of history, the fear of being ostracized by our digital tribe. But the hardware of the human brain remains the same. We are still wired with the same mirror neurons that caused the people of Strasbourg to see another Estrance and feel its pull. We are still susceptible to the same psychological pressures that can make a shared belief feel more real than our own senses. So, this 500-year-old story is not a curiosity. It is a warning. It is a call for a new kind of literacy, to recognize the invisible currents of social contagion that flow through our modern world. It is a reminder to question the rhythms we are being asked to dance to, and to be wary of the stages that are built to amplify our collective emotions. And so, we must end by asking a question. What is the modern mind virus you see spreading today? Is it a viral trend, a financial craze, a political outrage? What is the modern dance that we, as a society, are being compelled to perform? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's dissect the anatomy of our own modern madness.